Of course!
10 crazy cult practices. 10. No blood transfusions. Several religions believe that your essence, your spirit, is carried in your blood. And some beliefs say that you should not have blood transfusions. It makes you impure. One such organisation is, of course, the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're encouraged not to have blood transfusions. The era in which they originated was basically the pioneering age of blood transfusions, where knowledge of different types of blood and errors made when transfusing blood basically meant that some people died. It was believed by some people at the time that this was basically due to some kind of impurity, or God not wishing it to be the case. In actuality, it was different types of blood. So the Jehovah's Witnesses have the claim that you should not have blood transfusions. They also select out various Bible passages to try and support this particular view. This in turn leads to the deaths of thousands of people, because operations carried out without blood transfusions can lead to premature death. 9. No medication. There are some cults out there that believe that you should not have medication. You should not use any form of drugs for medical or recreational usage. Some such organisations claim that medicine itself is wrong, that you should rely on the spiritual practice alone. You have some aspects of New Age, but more prominently, organisations like Scientology and Falun Dafa, otherwise known as Falun Gong, basically have the view that you should be able to cure yourself. With Falun Gong, the belief is that traditional Chinese medicine can do everything you require. You don't need to have a modern doctor look at you. You don't need modern medication. With Scientology, they have a similar belief. This kind of practice in those beliefs and others leads towards premature death of a great many people. People dying prematurely because they reject modern medicine and the techniques that could help to save lives. 8. Self-immolation. As an act of protest, people might set themselves on fire, as with Buddhists during the Vietnam War, but also with people such as members of Falun Gong, who have lit themselves on fire in the past as an act of protest against the Chinese government. The question you have to ask yourself in these cases, and indeed others, is would they do it if they did not believe that they went to some kind of greater existence, or that they would continue in their existence, although their physical body is incinerated? When people set themselves on fire, when people obliterate their life in this way, or attempt to, would they do it if they believed there was no afterlife? Would they do it in sound mind, knowing that they're not going to get a greater spiritual enlightenment, they're not going to get a better next incarnation, and what they're fighting for might well be simply a delusional belief system? 7. Circumcision. This kind of genital mutilation, carried out mostly on men, is also carried out on women. It can reduce pleasure for men, but in the extreme cases that are really a kind of cult abuse. In the Middle East and beyond, young women are genitally mutilated. They have their clitoris removed. They have their vagina sewed up tight, used as breeding machines. This kind of sickening practice goes far beyond the more minor mutilations of a slight cut here and there, to the point where pleasure is removed and women are used as sex slaves, and almost entirely belongs to the Muslim religion. The idea that this should be justified, the idea that this is right, that this is what God wants, is complete and utter nonsense that causes massive amounts of suffering, ruining the lives of millions of women around the world. 6. Exorcism. Exorcism is a popular film topic, but in reality, the so-called exorcist is very often dealing with a person with mental illness, paranoid delusions, or a person who's created the idea of some kind of entity through their belief. In any case, we're dealing with certain psychological problems that are not being dealt with, and rather than being seen through the sound eye of modern medical science and psychology, instead it's seen through the lens of the spiritual and the religious, leading to bizarre rituals and indeed physical harm caused by this neglect, this abuse. People claiming to remove demons by carrying out certain practices, whether it's a Catholic priest beating a child, or whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses beating the feet of young children to keep them away from the devil's temptation. In many forms, exorcism is not merely a question of a person believing they're taken over by a different personality, but a person receiving abuse by an exorcist who can do profound physical and psychological harm to a person who really should receive proper medical attention. 5. Auditing. In Scientology, they have an auditing process where they use an e-meter and ask you a series of questions. When they see a slight increase in your supposed brain activity on the e-meter, they basically claim it's due to psychological stress. In actuality, it's merely down to a person slightly tensing their muscles in their hands when a particular topic comes up. From this, they diagnose a person with particular psychological problems. However, in many cases, this is not actually a question of helping people. Indeed, in most cases with Scientology, it has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with helping people psychologically. It's more a method of control and confession. Having confession in the group and knowledge on the person, a large file within Scientology, a person can be manipulated in such a way that they rely more and more on the organisation itself, rather than seeking genuine psychological advice from a true medical professional. The pseudoscience of Scientology causes considerable suffering due to their poor management and incredibly poor treatment. And the thing to remember with Scientology as well is, of course, the price tag. So when it comes down to using an e-meter, or for that matter a written test, or simply ticking boxes, it's basically to funnel you into a program. Some of these programs start off quite cheap, but eventually they build up to incredibly costly programs, supposedly for your psychological good, but in actuality to ensure that individuals such as the cult leader David Miscavige remains in finery as a multi-millionaire. 4. Human sacrifice. Although a rarity in the modern age, human sacrifice can take place. Indeed, there are cases when we look back in history of massive amounts of human sacrifice, believing to cure the ills of the people, to control the seasons, to appease the gods, to manipulate the nature of the world around us. Although a rarity now, there are cases where people have sacrificed individuals. Occasionally a cult will appear which might well kill people in the name of sacrifice, or a person with extreme mental illness believes that through sacrificing someone they can become stronger spiritually by executing a person. Although commonly when it comes down to cults, this kind of characteristic is incredibly rare in the modern era. 3. Baptism of the dead. The Church of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as the Mormons, they believe they can baptize the dead. They don't dunk corpses, but they basically claim to baptize the dead by focusing on their names. So they do a little ritual, a little prayer, and pray that these people will be saved. The idea is that Mormons in the afterlife will speak to these people, preach to them, and convince them of the validity of the Mormon Church. Although this doesn't really do that much harm, they have caused considerable offence amongst people who are related to the Jews of Europe, who were largely obliterated by Nazi Germany. The Mormons acquired the records of the people who had died, carried out almost as a matter of industrial production, baptisms of these dead people. By focusing on the names, focusing on the ideas, they can take anyone of any belief, simply baptize them after their death, and the idea is they've just saved another soul and made a new Mormon. 2. Spiritual suicide. There are various suicide cults which have appeared throughout human history. those claiming the end is nigh, or that a great change is upon us. Perhaps one of the most famous suicide cults was, of course, the Heaven's Gate cult. Numerous members commit suicide, believing that their body would die, but their spirit would ascend to a UFO that was following behind the Hale-Bopp comet. Such nonsense can only be believed by the brainwashed, those who've put aside their reason. However, very often these organisations use thought reform techniques to manipulate people to believe the ridiculous. So in some cases, being a sacrifice for your religion is seen as being a most honourable thing. To be carrying out an act of suicide for the sake of the spiritual good is seen as being a good thing. As with the case of suicide bombers, they may kill themselves, but they believe it will benefit them. And indeed it will benefit the religion and benefit the good work of God or whichever particular higher power they believe in. From the Buddhists who carried out their suicide acts in Vietnam when fighting the colonial French, or whether it comes down to the Tamil Tigers with suicide bombings in Sri Lanka and southern India, or certainly more famously in cases in Afghanistan, Iraq and Israel, where suicide bombers have carried out horrendous acts, obliterating themselves in the name of Allah. 1. Honour killings. Honour killings can appear in many forms, and in many ways is a disgusting practice. The belief that you preserve or perhaps even restore the spiritual purity of an individual by killing them. From the idea of a woman who refuses to marry a particular individual in an arranged marriage and so ends up being killed by a family relative. It can also be something such as a homosexual man whose family does not approve because of their religious practices, so they kill him believing that he'll be sent to heaven. It can also be a question of killing individuals who don't believe as you believe, believing that you'll give them a chance to actually find spiritual purity. In various religions, certainly not least Islam, you have a belief that by killing people who don't believe as you believe, rather than convincing them with sound argument, you will in fact allow them to become spiritually pure enough that they might well get into heaven. They might well become a good Muslim before they're judged by God. So a young woman who believes she's going on holiday to see family in Pakistan instead is forced into a marriage. She flees, or tries to, and then because of this act, she might well be killed by her own father because she did not wish to go through with that particular act. People call this an honour killing. Where is the honour in killing your own in the name of a ridiculous belief? But of course, where ridiculous beliefs are passed on as the perfect word of God, why would people doubt? If you've been indoctrinated for all of your life to believe that this is an acceptable action, out of grief for a person not following the orders you give, you decide to obliterate them because your daughter might be promiscuous, for example. It seems to be perfectly logical, although by obvious reasoning skills, this kind of view is primitive. Yet people who are indoctrinated are willing to believe that things such as honour killings are acceptable. And in some ways, I'm sure some suicide bombers also believe that their actions are in fact honourable because they might well be saving every single person that they blow up. So in some ways, the selfishness of these individuals is in fact covered by a selflessness in the way in which they dress up their belief. The dangers of many organisations and practices throughout the world is that you'll surrender your reason or not develop your logical skills. In many ways, this is the problem with delusional thinking. You believe things to be so when you truly don't know. You make things seem to be real and you accept what people tell you. You believe it. You accept it as your worldview. And from that position, you're willing to carry out whichever acts are permitted by those who claim to have the answers. It's a question of pure fiction and irrationality.